So another problem that Bush had was that the old values no longer worked. And what I mean by this is the values that were important in the Cold War, in which Bush was, again, the guy, um, those didn't really work anymore. So let me just give you an example. Our Cold War, that's what CW stands for, values and identity, were really defined by us not being them. So for example, if Reagan's going to call the Soviet Union the evil empire, that makes us the good guys. And so a lot of who we were in the United States and the West was defined as what the Soviet Union was not. I know that sounds weird, but that's really kind of how we do think about things. So those old values are no longer really our values. Like now the Soviet Union's gone now. How do we define who we are? And let me just give you a couple, like maybe one example here. In the Cold War, for example, freedom of movement was a huge deal. Like, you know, the Iron Curtain went up and people couldn't move from East Berlin to West Berlin. People couldn't move from the Soviet Union into Israel. And there were all these sorts of freedom of movement things that the United States and the Western Europe were really, they focused on this. This was a very important freedom for people, that they get to move, they get to choose where they want to be. Huge in the Cold War. Now, Cold War's over, Soviet Union basically collapses, and the whole conversation shifts from freedom of movement to this idea of how can we stop the people from the Eastern European countries, which are relatively poor, from packing up and all moving into France and Germany and killing the economies in those countries. I mean, in 1990, that was the big concern in Europe. Not that the Soviet Union was collapsing, but what were all those people in Eastern Europe going to do? Are they going to flood in? And so all of a sudden, like overnight, the conversation about freedom of movement changes. And it just sort of it just changes. I know that's just one example, but it really changes this idea. And if there's no them, then it's a lot harder to figure out who we are. And we're going to talk about this when we talk about Clinton, that the foreign policy during the 1990s was a lot about this of who the heck are we? What the heck are we supposed to be doing in this world? I get the Cold War. I get even after 9/11, but what's it all about right now? One new theme that pops up in the 90s and even in 1992 that's actually not very helpful when it comes out to it. One new theme that pops up is the U.S. starts to be defined in opposition to Europe. Like you guys have heard, like, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, that old book from like the 1990s. Well, there was also this sort of conversation about the U.S. is from Mars and Europe is from Venus, this idea that the U.S. is sort of the cowboy and the warlike countries, and Europe is peaceful and green and all that kind of stuff. And that just wasn't a very useful opposition, if you're the United States especially, because the Europeans weren't, they were different, but it just wasn't like it was bad, and so we can define ourselves as good. The 90s was a really weird thing in terms of how the U.S. saw itself in the world. All right, you're going to watch another video. I know I'm bouncing you back and forth. But you're going to watch another video here that's going to be Nixon. Now remember, Nixon's been out of office and all this kind of stuff. But Nixon in 1992 talking about what does it mean now that the United States is the only superpower in the world.